if any of the structures within that limbic system are changed or disrupted in their development, then the connections between thought and action are destroyed. And so one of the first things we see is the children tend to be very impulsive. They don't understand consequences of behavior.
Welcome to the Honestly Adoption Podcast, a show about adoption, foster care, advocacy, and becoming the best caregiver possible. Pull up a chair. We're glad you've joined us. Here are your hosts, Mike and Kristen Berry, with Nicole Jurgis.
Welcome back to the Honestly Adoption Podcast, and welcome to you if this is your first time tuning into the show. We're glad you guys have joined us. Man, we love the show, and we love the guests that you guys are going to get to hear today. Our good friend, Dr. Ira Chasnoff, joining us on the show. It's actually an interview we did a while back, but we want to share it with you all about how to respond to impulsive behaviors, how to respond to behaviors with children who have a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Wealth of knowledge. We love Dr. Chasnoff. He's a good friend of the Honestly Adoption Company and just an all-around amazing guy. We love him to death. You're going to love this interview. But guys, I want to tell you something really, really awesome before Kristen and I, along with Nicole Jurgis, jump into today's show. Guys, we just opened up the Insight one-day training event for registration. Now, a lot of you guys probably attended the Insight virtual conference back in the spring. There was so much response from that event, from that 2-day experience. So many people were like, man, could you guys just keep it going? Could you guys just, do we have to end, man? Do we have to stop the conference? We got all that great response back from you guys after the conference was over, and it had us thinking, you know what? We need something to bridge that time between conferences, because the Insight virtual conference takes place every spring, and so we've decided to expand the Insight family, the Insight training family, if you want to call it that, by adding a special one-day training event, and that is Insight one-day training. Let me tell you about this. It's happening Tuesday, October 19th, exclusively online, and we are excited to welcome our good friend, Jessica Sinarski, who is a highly sought-after therapist, author, speaker. She makes brain science practical. And through her work through children's books and trainings, absolutely amazing, insightful information. We're also joined by Dr. Laura Anderson, who has worked with adoptive families as a clinical psychologist and has been licensed for more than 20 years, and she's also an adoptive parent. Dr. Anderson was with us for the Insight virtual conference this past spring. She's joining us once again for one-day training. And then, of course, myself and Kristen will also be presenting. And this year, we are going to be talking about trauma in the brain, attachment and trauma, and then how to heal, how to help your child heal. We're going to be covering topics like trauma's impact on the brain, trauma and behavior, trauma's impact on attachment, and then trauma and disrupted attachment, and really conclude everything with this reality, this truth that healing is possible. But guys, here's the best thing to know about Insight one-day training is that it is only $29.95 per person if you are attending individually as a parent or caregiver, $49.95 per person if you need continuing education credit, and if you would like to have lifetime access to the content, it's just $59.95 per person. Super inexpensive, super budget friendly. We're going to spend a whole day together talking about this valuable topic and understanding trauma in the brain. You guys, registration is open now, and if you register by September 15th, we're also including a fast action bonus training video suite with Jessica Sinarski, Dr. Anderson, and the two of us. You can get topics like understanding attachment, dealing with burnout, behavior management. We're including all that in this video suite, but you have to register by September 15th. So register now, jump over to honestlyadoption.com/one day and save your spot to this amazing one-day training event happening October 19th, exclusively online. And even if you can't attend live, you'll get replay access and you'll be able to see everything we talked about. We can't wait to present this, to host this. honestlyadoption.com/one day. We hope to see you at Insight One Day Training. Okay, guys, on with our amazing interview with our good friend, Dr. Ira Chasnoff. We're tackling a big topic today, one that we get a lot of messages, a lot of emails, blog comments, you name it, from, which is, understanding the behaviors of kids with FASDs. And that's why we've invited you on. And I'm super excited to have you on here. You've never been on our podcast before. So,
no, right.
Yeah, so we've crossed that bridge. Super excited. And I want to talk right out of the gate about impulsivities, which is I know a broad topic when it comes to kids, but when it comes to our kiddos who have FASDs, and like I said a moment ago, we receive hundreds, we receive tons of emails. I can't even keep track. But I want to ask you right out of the gate about this. The biggest question that we receive is, why the impulsivities, and then really the how. So why does this happen, and how can you parent through this? So let's just start there.
Okay. I think the first thing you have to understand is that behaviors we talk about in children with prenatal alcohol exposure and the changes that occur in the brain when the fetus is exposed to alcohol. Very simply, one of the major effects of alcohol is that it will change the structure of the brain and the connections between the different parts of the brain. So through prenatal exposure, the central part of the brain is called the limbic system. It sits right direct midline of the brain, is the primary target of alcohol during the first trimester. And if any of the structures within that limbic system are changed or disrupted in their development, then the connections between thought and action are destroyed. And so one of the first things we see is the children tend to be very impulsive. They don't understand consequences of behavior. And let me just give you an example. If you're walking along a sidewalk and you get to an intersection, the first thing you do, of course, is you look to see if any cars are coming. That image of the car enters the brain through the eye, travels all the way back to the back part of the brain. It's called the occipital lobe. Mm-hmm. And that's where the visual cortex is. And so the part of the brain you actually see the car with is at the back of the brain. Now, once you see that car, that image flashes forward all the way to the front part of the brain. It's called the prefrontal cortex. Mm-hmm. And that's where the image fires off the regulatory system, the dopamine receptors. And it's the dopamine firing off that then tells you to stop walking, mm-hmm. to wait for that car to pass. Now, that's called motor regulation. Part of that process is that as information moves from the back part of the brain to the front part of the brain, it must pass through the limbic system. And that's where the hitch is. Because instead of that information getting up to the prefrontal cortex, it gets stuck in the limbic system. And so if you ask the child, didn't you see that car coming? They say, sure, I saw it coming. But that doesn't inform their behaviors. And so that's what, as parents, that's what we see as being impulsive. And you can go through all the different parts of the brain. You can talk about any of the behaviors we see in alcohol-exposed children, and it will actually explain how that happens. Now, the job of parents and teachers is to look beyond the behaviors that we see and understand the brain basis of those behaviors. Because if we understand the brain basis, then we can begin to provide appropriate interventions. Reacting afterwards, yelling at the child because they ran out in front of a car simply doesn't work. And
Absolutely.
The child learns nothing from that. And so our strategies have to be much more proactive.
Yeah, I was nodding here. You can't see me, but I was nodding as you were saying that, because right before you said it, I'm thinking I'm replaying all the time, and all the people that we know as well who have resorted to, what we would actually call traditional parenting methods, whether or not they're right or wrong. Because that's the way I was raised. I mean, I was raised. My parents would have yelled at me, didn't you see that car? Stop, And you're right, it just doesn't work. And I'm sure Nicole and Kristen would totally agree with me on that.
Oh, absolutely. Wanting to talk more about that too, then what does a proactive strategy look like?
Well, let's take a very practical example. I get this one from teachers as well as parents. You have a 4-year-old child, and you say, Johnny, we're going into the lunchroom now. They're at school. We're going to the lunchroom now. And what are the rules of the lunchroom? And Johnny says, you don't run, you don't hit, you don't pinch. And the teacher says, great. They go into the lunchroom, and what does Johnny do? He runs, he hits, he pinches. So he knows the rules. He just can't take those rules and move them forward to the regulatory center of the brain. So rather than impulsivity, we look at this as the ability to regulate behaviors. Now, what can you do about that? The first thing that parents and teachers have to remember, the way children with FASDs learn is through repeat, repeat, repeat. And so, and I'm sure that's very frustrating. I'm sure all of you have experienced that you have to just go time and time again with the same thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So what is it you can do? First of all, frame rules in a positive manner. So instead of saying we don't run, it's we walk in the lunchroom. And so that's the first step. The second is to just like the teacher did, what are the rules? You go over it before the child gets into the situation and intervene if you see the child starting to be disruptive or be impulsive. Now the question is, what can you do about it? The most important thing is that parents understand behaviors, look beyond what you see, and understand the behavior from what's happening in the brain. So let's take an example. Let's make it simple. A 4-year-old child, they're at school, and the teacher turns to Johnny and says, Johnny, we're going into the lunchroom now. What are the rules? And Johnny says, you don't run, you don't hit, you don't pinch. Teacher says, terrific. They go into the lunchroom, and what does Johnny do? He runs, he hits, he pinches. Now, children with FASDs have difficulty taking what they know and applying it to regulate their behaviors, to control their behaviors. And that's because of all those mechanisms within the limbic system that have been affected. Taking information from the back of the brain to the front of the brain so it can be regulated. So what can the teacher do? Well, the first thing is you need to make rules that are stated in a positive manner rather than negative. So, for example, instead of saying, don't run, you say, we walk in the lunchroom. So that's the first thing. The second is you have to be, as a parent or a teacher, you have to be very proactive. You have to be able to look ahead to see what's happening next. So as soon as the child begins to get off task or begins to exhibit a behavior such as starting to run, you have to step in. And what you do, you can agree ahead of time on a nonverbal cue or a verbal cue for the child. So, for example, if you see the child getting ready to run, you catch his eye and you pull your ear. And that's a signal for the child to stop, think, and then to walk. So there are various ways that you can do this so that it doesn't stigmatize the child. Mm-hmm. And when we work with teachers and classrooms, these are the kinds of strategies we use. And then the most important thing is for teachers and parents to remember is that children with FASDs, in order to learn, whether it's to learn how to manage behaviors or to learn academically, the key is repeat, repeat, repeat. Because what the research has shown is that children have good short-term memory, children with FASDs, whereas moving information from short-term into long-term memory is very difficult. So that's why many of you may be helping your children with their third grade multiplication tables. And one moment they know 2 times 3 is 6. And you come back to that a little while later and ask them 2 times 3. They're not being obstinate. It's they truly don't remember it. It's not in long-term memory. And that's why we say you have to repeat, repeat, repeat in order to teach behaviors or to teach academics.
Goodness, I'm thinking in my mind, where were you 6 years ago when I was about to pound my head through drywall, with math in particular, I think it was with my son, my oldest son. So
oh my goodness, or reading with our daughter and now 2 of our younger sons.
Yeah, no kidding. Now something you said that I found interesting, and I wanted to ask you about this. When you're talking about phrasing questions in a positive way, which I completely agree with that, because we've seen that the positive effects of that with our son. In fact, just with something that happened yesterday. In fact, but you phrased it when we were talking about not running. Don't run. Instead of saying don't run, you said we walk. Is it important to use words like we? So almost for a teacher to say, I'm with you in this, or we all do this together. Is that important? Is that something that we should be doing more of, using words like that, like we, or almost self-identifying with them, if that makes sense?
Absolutely. That, and that's with all children, not children with just with FASDs. The more that the child feels part of the parent's world, the less stigmatization, the better. And as we're talking about this, I'm realizing something I don't think we've talked about before, Mike, is one of the things we've developed. It's a computer-based behavior management system called Cause and Consequence. Are you familiar with that?
Interesting. Yeah, I think I think either you and I talked about that during the Oasis interview, or maybe off air during that interview. But I know we've talked about it before. I just don't know if we've talked about it in any of our interviews that have aired. So yeah, please share what that is. It
was developed specifically for adoptive parents and teachers. And it's been researched and shown to work with children ages 5 on up, and with some pretty bright 4-year-olds, if they can understand some of the concepts. But what it is, it's a CD-ROM you simply put into your computer and, load it. I don't know all the technical stuff, but anyway, it loads automatically. And it gives you a pathway. So what you do in the left-hand column, you find the behavior problem you're dealing with, such as short attention span. And then it walks you across a series of interventions from least intrusive to most intrusive. And you want to use the least intrusive intervention, because part of what we have to do is help the children retain some sort of feelings of self-efficacy. And it's very simple to use. Hundreds, if not thousands, of families have it in their homes. Many school districts have it on their website, and we're hoping. Right now, it's CD-ROM based for your computer, but we are working with programmers now to turn it into something that you can load onto your smartphone or your iPad. And so if you're at the grocery store and things are falling apart, you can go right to this system and it says, okay, here's what you need to do. I mention it because it's just been so successful. As a lot of our adoptive parents live and die with it. Because it just takes them, and a lot of school districts, as I said, use it. So it's great for behavior management. So a lot of what I've been talking about is on that CD-ROM. It says, okay, here's what you have to do next. And you use it going from least intrusive to most intrusive. So it helps the child retain some feeling of self-efficacy.
Yeah, that's perfect. And we will, I'm assuming there's a place that we can, go ahead, Kristen.
Oh, sorry. That can be found on the NTIUpstream.com website.
Yes.
Okay, that's perfect. And we'll include links for that for our listeners, links in the show notes and on the honestlyadoption.com page as well. So yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, and that is what parents need. Gosh, you probably have parents right now who are listening who are jumping up and down and cheering because they have been, feel like they've been pounding their head against the wall, trying to find solutions. And this is a great solution.
Yeah, it's a step in the right direction. I hesitate to say it's a solution.
Okay,
but
maybe that's too.
It certainly will be helpful.
I think Nicole was commenting. What were you about to say, Nicole?
No, I just said I had no idea that was available. That's awesome. I will be looking at it.
Yeah, I hadn't, in all our conversations, I hadn't even thought about it. But as you bring up some of this, and we've done webinars on it. So if you're still doing webinars sometime, maybe we could even do a webinar that demonstrates it, how to use it.
That would be great. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, that's good, and you're right. I think it just moving towards a solution, maybe not the end all solutions, but because some of the behaviors we deal with are curveballs that we were not expecting. It seems like sometimes our kiddos are always up in the game. So
we talked a little bit about impulsivity and how FASD changes the brain. What are some other behaviors found in children who suffer from this disorder, and what are some key things that we as parents can do in terms of strategies?
That's a great question. Complex, but let's try to break it down. When I think about the behaviors that children exhibit with FASDs, I think about the behaviors from the perspective of information processing. Information processing is the way we bring information into the brain and use it. And from research, we've broken this down into three main areas of behaviors. Those three areas are neurocognitive functioning, self-regulation, and adaptive behaviors. So let's look at each one of those. And as we describe these, you're going to recognize your children. The first is neurocognitive. Now, what everybody jumps to under neurocognitive is IQ. Kids aren't smart. Well, that's absolutely not true. The great majority of children affected by prenatal alcohol exposure will have IQs that are in the normal range, and in fact, often have quite high IQs. And one of the young ladies featured in our film, Moment to Moment, is 22 now. She has an IQ of 125. So IQ can be just about anywhere. However, the other aspects of neurocognitive functioning, one is executive functioning, the ability to plan and complete a task. That is, when you tell your child, go turn off the porch light, they'll often either not follow your direction or even if they try, they can't quite figure out how to accomplish the task. Let me give you a simpler explanation. Many times as a physician, I'll finish, examining the child, doing my evaluation, and they're sitting up on the examining table, and I'll say, okay, go to the scale, go to the door, and come to me. Now you'll notice that's 4 steps. And I'll say, tell me what I said. And they said, you said to jump down off the table, go over to the scale, go to the door, and come to me. I said, that's great. Go ahead. They'll jump down off the table, and then they get this look on their face like a deer caught. Where to go next? So even though they know cognitively what they're supposed to do, the sequence of events, putting that into action, moving that information forward to the prefrontal cortex that guides their next steps, it's not there. Now, they're not being stubborn, and they're not trying to tick you off. They literally cannot follow through. So that's another aspect of behaviors that teachers and parents can very easily misinterpret. Oh, he's just not trying. And when we train teachers, we talk about how to address these kinds of things in the classroom, and we can get into that a little bit more in a moment. Another area of neurocognitive functioning is memory. Now, if you go to a psychologist for just a regular psychological evaluation, they'll come back and say, he's fine, he's just not trying. His memory is fine. But there are all sorts of different kinds of memory. And I hope this will work over a podcast. We're going to try a little exercise that I give professionals when I train them. We will give this task to your audience. And so everybody at home that's listening to this, here's your task. The first task is, tell me your telephone number. Okay, which was easy. You got that.
Yep.
All right, here's the next task. Tell me your telephone number backwards. What you had to do is take your telephone number that you have in long-term memory and move it out of long-term memory into what's called working memory. And many of you, you did it one of 2 ways. And if you're a visual learner, you literally posted your telephone number in front of your eyes, imaginarily, and then read it backwards. And some of you who are auditory learners said your telephone number forward very quickly, essentially memorizing it, and then were able to say it backwards. That's working memory.
Interesting.
And with FASDs have great difficulty with is working memory. And that's why math is often so difficult for them. Okay, here's your third task. You ready? Tell me your telephone number backwards. Now see, what you had to do is go through that whole same process again, because you have your telephone number in long-term memory. But I ask you a question, tell me your telephone number backwards. You knew that was not really that important to know your telephone numbers. And so you discarded it. You didn't put it into long-term memory.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the difference between short-term and long-term memory. And as I said before, children with FASDs have good short-term memory. They have trouble moving information from short-term into long-term memory. And that's where we run into problems. And that's why we say when we're trying to teach children behaviors or teach them something academically, it's all about repeat, repeat, repeat.
Yeah.
The second area is self-regulation. And unfortunately, I have many, many cases of children who, when they finally come to us, have seen psychiatrists and psychologists and have been worked up one way or another. And as young as the age of 4 or 5 have been diagnosed with bipolar because they go from 0 to 60 in a moment. And they're fine, and something nobody else recognizes sets them off, and they're they're out of sorts. They're just emotionally out of control. That is not bipolar. It's emotional dysregulation. And I urge parents to think of their children not from a mental health perspective necessarily, but from a regulatory perspective. So instead of saying a child is bipolar, you can look at it from emotional dysregulation. Now, why is that so important? Because if you say a child is bipolar, he's going to get put on medication. Yeah. Whereas if you look at it from a perspective of emotional dysregulation, there are therapeutic approaches.
Yeah.
So when we work with professionals, physicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, this is the track we try to take them down. And there are all sorts of strategies for addressing any of these things. And problems in self-regulation is why so many children get diagnosed with ADHD. The research, we published one paper that shows that about 74% of children with prenatal alcohol exposure do meet criteria for ADHD. But the problem is, it's a different kind of ADHD. It's not the classic genetic ADHD. And these children respond to medications and therapies differently than from children with genetic ADHD. And that's why it's so important to really, again, look at them from a regulatory perspective. And then the third category is the functioning. And when it really comes down to it, this is the aspect that has the greatest impact on lives. Adaptive functioning is the ability to take information you know and apply it to daily living skills. And in the film I mentioned Moment to Moment, the young lady with the IQ of 125 can't tell time. She's very, very bright. Cannot look at a clock, an analog clock, with hands and tell you what time it is. She cannot count money. And this is one of the areas that most clearly differentiates children with FASDs from children with other types of diagnoses and disabilities. So those are the three areas of functioning. So that's what we've tried to do with Cause and Consequence, is break down these types of brain-based behavioral difficulties and apply interventions that work.
Hey guys, it's Mike here. Man, I hope you're enjoying the interview that we're doing right now with Dr. Ira Chasnoff. He is amazing, isn't he? Gosh, we love him. He never makes us feel stupid. He never makes us feel like we don't know what we're talking about. Absolutely incredible. Listen, you heard us mention at the beginning of the show that Dr. Chasnoff is the author of the book, The Mystery of Risk. The Mystery of Risk is all about drugs, alcohol, pregnancy, and the vulnerable child. It really walks readers through the ill effects of a baby's exposure to drugs and alcohol while in the womb. And let me tell you guys something, this is a must read. Listen, if you jump over to the podcast page, honestlyadoption.com, click on the resource tab, you can read more about the Mystery of Risk and even order a copy of the book. Seriously, you do not want to miss reading this book. Okay, that's all I needed to tell you guys. Back to the show.
This next question kind of deals with exactly what you were talking about. Because some of us deal with those extreme behaviors, those obsessive behaviors, and doctors do want to push, the bipolar diagnosis because our children can be dangerous. So you were talking a little bit about this, but how do we handle that on a day-to-day basis? Because this goes into traumatizing other people. This goes into dangerous behavior for other people. And, as much as we want to be we want to take those steps and skills to help them, when you're at that dangerous moment, it's harder to use those skills because you're trying to keep everyone safe.
Yeah, wow, that's difficult. It's easy for me to sit here and tell you about all the kinds of things that you should be doing, could. But in the moment, it is extremely difficult. And I know parents with children with FASDs often feel like they're on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because you have to be there. The best thing you can do, first of all, is understand once the child gets into a rage, and we'll just call it a rage as a general term for the kinds of things you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Once the child is in the rage, there's very little you can do. And so the key is to try to step in early. Now, how do you step in early? You have to become the external brain. You have to recognize the cues. When we work with children and families, one of our goals is to start with external control. Parents recognizing cues and stepping in. Now, how can you figure out some of those cues? A good way to start is with a behavioral log. And it would take two of you to do this together. Go through the day and record everything that's happening in one column, and then in the second column, recording the child's behavioral responses. And after a few days, what you'll begin to recognize is a pattern. Now, sometimes it's going to be very obvious and sometimes not. But if you can recognize what those cues are, or what those circumstances are, you can learn to avoid them. I live up north, and I well remember when our children were young, big snowstorm outside, we're in a carpool, and you go rushing in with a toddler and say, get in your snowsuit, we got to go. We have to go get carpool. And of course, this just sets the child off. Any child, a typical child. Well, a child with FASDs is just going to fall apart. And so, a way to approach it is in 10 minutes, we're going to carpool. Yeah. And then back in 5 minutes. So those kinds of things will help, but then add something to that. For instance, I like to use egg timers so that the child can see as the time is going. Now, this gets to something called multisensory input. Some children are more responsive to auditory interventions. Some children are better attuned to visual interventions. And the best way for children and adults to learn is through multisensory. So that's why when I go out, I always have PowerPoints and pictures and graphs, because not only am I giving information from an auditory perspective, I'm also illustrating it with visual. And so you're getting two forms of sensory input. And so in therapy with children, we give them crunchy carrots to chew on. We give them visual input, auditory input, tactile input. And so it's that multisensory approach you can use to try to avoid the kinds of things that set your child off. And there are strategies related to this that we use in the classroom also. So that's one thing. The second, as we advance in therapy and working with the children, we taught children with FASDs how to recognize their cues. So an example, how does your engine run? And some of you may have heard of this. Well, we use that concept, and that's a very easy concept. Is your engine too low? This worked for our children with IQs below the range of normal. And we could say, Johnny, how is your engine running? And the kid jumping around and agitated, and he says, my engine's too high. And you say, what can you do? And this is where fidget toys come in. Fidget toys, muscle clenching. So there are strategies that can help children self-regulate, self-calm. You try to recognize early, if necessary, even remove himself from the situation. Now, let me speak to that just for a moment. Let me say loud and clear, timeouts don't work.
No,
I'm going to say that. I'm going to say it a second time. Timeouts don't work. All timeouts do is cause behaviors to escalate. So what does work is something we call cool down, and it's on the cause and consequence. It's at the far end of the scale is when the child recognizes he's getting out of control and removes himself from the situation. So it's the child's decision to remove himself and not the parents or the teachers telling him to remove himself. But these are all strategies that do work.
Oh, absolutely. I think sometimes it's the when you have two children with FASD and you know what sets one off, but so does the other, and they like to do that. And that's the part that you can't remove. You can't remove that trigger because
they escalate each other. I mean, they literally become triggers for one another. We experience that as well. So something popped into my mind that Nicole, you and John do when it comes to one of your son's bedtimes, that you start, I think you start like a half hour before bedtime or even longer, reminding him, hey, bedtime's coming up. And that's actually a strategy we've shared with parents when we've gone to conferences to teach parents about this. And it's, Ira, I think you hit the nail on the head with that, because the imagery that always comes to my mind is it's the difference between turning a speedboat and turning an aircraft carrier. Aircraft carriers need a lot of time and a lot of space, whereas a speedboat can turn on a dime. And a normal functioning child, may be able to be told, not always, but often, 5 or 10 minutes before, hey, it's bedtime. Whereas one of our kiddos needs a lot more time and a lot more space.
And we've learned that our son can't handle the visual timers. He will obsessively watch those, and he will get more and more agitated as he watches it go down. And so we try and take as much, like we don't even have a clock in his room. And we try and remove clocks as much as possible, because if he's watching the time, he gets angry. So we have to verbally tell him, but if he's watching it, then he gets angry. So see, that's a good cue for you to recognize. It's great that you know that, and you have to communicate that with teachers also, that he responds to auditory rather than visual. That's why we tell a lot of teachers, don't put up those decorations in the classroom. It makes the classroom look great to have things flying from the ceiling and pasted to the walls, but that overstimulates a lot of children. So that kind of visual stimulation is just too much. Another problem that you're referring to is transitions. And so what can you do about these transitions? Whether it's, the visual timer doesn't work for you, but are there other things you can do? You can line up, like if the child's going to have to go to bed, line up his pajamas, his toothbrush, and sometimes we have the children make a chart that helps them get ready for school or get ready for bedtime, and then they can follow those pictures. And the more control the child himself has over this process, the better. So letting him follow the picture, that he's drawn himself is going to give him that sense of control that he otherwise wouldn't have.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking about my son's first day of kindergarten a couple of years ago, when we looked over and he was standing on his head and bouncing all over the place while the rest of the children were sitting listening to reading. And it was a classroom where there was just tons of decorations. You mentioned things swinging from the ceiling. A go-getter of a teacher, awesome teacher, but my kid was freaking out because he was just overstimulated. So, and it actually brings up another question I want to ask you. You mentioned teachers, which kind of propels me into what I would call a hot topic question, and that has to do with professionals, because a lot of us, like we're talking on this podcast right now, and we're listening to you as parents, and we're feverishly writing down notes, but then how do we translate everything we're talking about, or what you're teaching us right now, into a conversation with a therapist or a pediatrician or a teacher? Because oftentimes, one of the biggest roadblocks we experience as parents comes through the form of dealing with professionals. You have a pediatrician that you're trying to explain this to, and even if you have a diagnosis in hand, you're in an IEP meeting, you name it, trying to explain all of this to professionals. How do you do that? What do you say? How do you show them or convince them, I guess would be a better word to use, of what's going on with your child?
Okay, I'm going to teach you a phrase that you need to repeat, repeat, repeat. And that phrase is, I am concerned. Now, why do I say it that way? If you go into a professional, to a doctor, let's say you go into your pediatrician, you say, my child has this diagnosis and you don't understand it. Let me tell you what this is. Let me give you all these papers and all these documents, and you can read all this information and you will learn. That's very much a threat to a physician, nurse, teacher. But if you go in and say, I am concerned because my son has been diagnosed with this, and I know the best thing we can do is work together. And here's how, I'd like to proceed. Back in the 60s, there was something called transactional analysis, which was the whole big I'm okay, you're okay movement. Now, I know many of you out there, you younger folks, are laughing at us folks from the 60s, but that was a big thing back then. The big message of the TA movement was take responsibility for your own actions, your own thoughts. And that's what we're saying here. You cannot challenge someone, but you can give it as an I message. I am concerned, and I know if we work together, it doesn't do any good to take my book to them, to say, watch this film. Although I would love every physician in America to have my book, that's not going to happen. So you're caught. You have to be an advocate for your child because nobody else will be.
Yeah, that's good.
At the same time, you have to balance that with understanding that no professional wants to be challenged.
Yeah.
And so it has to be, here's how we can work together.
Yeah. We often tell parents, because a lot of the questions we get have to do with IEP meetings. And gosh, we've worked with more parents. In fact, Kristen has worked with several parents who have gone in guns blazing, and it's you this, you don't understand this, and I this, and it just what we tell parents in those moments is that, you know what, you're going in crazy, and crazy is all they see. What's going on with your child is getting lost in all of this because of the way you're approaching this meeting and these professionals, a principal, a guidance counselor, a teacher. I couldn't agree with you more. That's gold.
I attended many IEPs, and a lot of parents will go in with cause and consequence on CDrom and say, here's what we're doing at home, and it's working. I want you to look at this, because if you've got a bridge between the home and the school, this gives you a structure, and they can click on it and see what the behavior management strategy is. And so the parents and the teachers are doing the same thing. What you're saying is, and even if it's not the CD-ROM, if you have found things that work at school, at home, if you find things that work at home and you go into the IEP, listen, say, I'm concerned and we'd like to try this out with you. Some families have to end up taking a lawyer in, an educational lawyer, to get the kinds of services that they need for their child.
It's a lot to do whenever you're dealing with all of the stuff going on at home. And I think a lot of times what happens with parents is we just kind of lose hope. And so, like, what kind of encouragement would you give to parents out there? I know I've been there, probably within the last month. I mean, you just feel hopeless. And you just feel like,
let me tell you a story. Let me tell you a story, and it's fresh on my mind because it just happened. A young family came to us many, many years ago, had adopted she was, I think, 3 or 4. No, I'm sorry. She was about 18 months at the time of adoption. He lived in another state, and so were not aware of our program until the child was about 3 years of age. And the family called and were in dire, had this adopted child from Russia, who finally had heard about us, brought her in. Well, this young lady not only had suffered the ravages of living in an institution, she did not have fetal alcohol syndrome, but had what's called ARND, alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder. So essentially, she looked normal, but she had all the neurobehavioral difficulties. And quite honestly, the school often stated that this adoptive mother was just a pain in the ass. I mean, that was it.
Oh, I've heard that one before. I think I'm known as that.
Yeah.
Now, fast forward to this past May, this young lady graduated as valedictorian of her senior high school class.
Wow. And
she has now got a full scholarship to a top university, and is having difficulties, but is thriving. She's aware of what she needs to do to learn and to live. I have lots of stories like this.
Wow.
The daily difficulties that parents face, it seems never ending. Yeah. But we have a lot of really great stories. Some not so great. But it is possible, and I don't have any easy answers for you.
Yeah, it won't be easy, and it's not easy, but that's hope. And I for those of you that are listening to this right now, I know we have a lot of parents who have children who have an FASD. That's hope. And you said this, going back to something you said earlier, you were talking about the girl featured in Moment to Moment, the documentary that NTI Upstream has produced, which we highly recommend everybody get. We'll put a link to the NTI Upstream store in the show notes. But you mentioned, as you were talking about the girl who has trouble with an analog clock, you said she's in her second year of college. and if the parents listening are anything like me, you just went, wow, second year of college. Okay, that's hope. Like, that's hope. That lets you know that your 12-year-old or your 10-year-old, there is hope for them, that this is not a death sentence. And that's unfortunately the way some people tend to look at it. But I think with that story,
you want to know a funny part of that story?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mother, and you've seen the film, and so you know Carol, the mother. Kara, the young lady's name, moved out about a year ago now, and is living relatively close, but living in an apartment with 2 roommates. Carol, as a mother, was food. Carol had been living with the roommate probably about 3 or 4 months, and Carol went over frequently. And she went over one time to take food to all the girls, and she saw a big poster board up, divided into days of the week, with Kara's schedule on it. And Carol said, "Kara, I am so proud of you. That calendar that I've always used for you. You need one yourself." And Carol looked at her and said, "Oh, I didn't do it. My roommates did." So
that's great.
So it's help, but it's part of her life, and those around here who love her know that there are some things that Kara needs.
Absolutely. So we can hope, Nicole, and pray for people to be roommates for our kids someday who are willing to follow our same structure. That's our hope.
That's
our hope. Yeah. Well, Ira, thank you so much for your partnership. We love NTI Upstream and the work that you guys are doing. We consider you guys partners and friends. So thank you for that. But also thank you for just giving us the last hour. This has been a huge gift to us, to the Jurgis family, Nicole and her husband, and to me and Kristen as well, but also to our listeners. So thank you. I can't say it enough. Thank you for all the numerous webinars, recordings. We can't thank you enough for that.
Well, it's my pleasure. Believe me.
Yeah, we greatly appreciate you being on the show for this episode, and I'm sure our listeners have questions, and you can send those questions to us at info@confessionsmail.com, and we will do our best to answer them. We're in communication with Dr. Chasnoff and also with Gabe Chasnoff, who is the producer of Moment to Moment. And you guys are always gracious to answer our questions, so we really appreciate that. So we'll make sure that if we have any questions that come to us, that we'll reach out and we'll find the best answer for you. So again, thank you guys. Thanks for this your insight, your expertise, Dr. Chasnoff. We really appreciate it. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Honestly Adoption Podcast, a resource courtesy of the Honestly Adoption Company. To learn more about us, visit www.honestlyadoption.com.